Meet Sam. He's 32, he's a project manager at a logistics company, and he's very good at his job in the specific way that means nobody outside his company has ever heard of him. Now meet the other three versions of Sam. Same person, same age, same job title, same responsibilities, same competence. The only difference is which country he happens to live in. There's American Sam, British Sam, Australian Sam, and Canadian Sam. 4 men, 1 career, 4 completely different sets of rules about what happens to the money. American Sam earns $100,000. British Sam earns the equivalent, which at today's exchange rate is about $74,000. Australian Sam earns about $142,000. Canadian Sam earns about $140,000. On paper, they are paid identically. In practice, one of them keeps almost $11,000 a year more than another, and it is not the one most people would guess. Then, when we account for what each of them actually gets in return for the money that's taken, the ranking shuffles again. And then, right at the end, we're going to give all 4 of them 2 children, and the entire scoreboard turns upside down. The country that finishes dead last on take-home pay finishes first once there are kids in the house, and the gap isn't small. So who actually keeps the most? Let's find out. A note on the method before anyone types it. Somebody's already writing the comment. I know, because it's the same comment on every video that does this. You can't compare salaries across countries at exchange rates. That's meaningless. It's a fair objection, and I want to answer it properly rather than pretend it isn't there. There are 2 ways to run this comparison. You can take the market salary for the same job in each country, which tells you what a local person actually earns, or you can take one amount of money and convert it, which tells you what happens to identical money under 4 different systems. I'm doing the second one, deliberately, because it isolates the thing we're actually testing. If I gave each Sam a different gross salary, we'd just be measuring which country pays project managers better, and the tax systems would be buried underneath that. Holding the money, constant means every difference you see from here is caused by the rules, not by the job market. The exchange rate objection is also less abstract than it sounds. Anyone weighing up a job offer abroad or deciding whether to move home is doing exactly this conversion on the back of an envelope. It's a real calculation that real people make. And I'm not stopping at take home. We'll adjust for what each system gives back and then adjust again for what it costs to live there. By the end, the exchange rate is doing almost none of the work. One more thing worth flagging up front. All 4 Sams are single employed with no student debt and no dependents until the last section where that changes. Every figure is for the current tax year. Tax systems get rewritten constantly, so treat these as accurate today and directionally right for a while rather than eternal. Round 1, gross to net. American Sam, $100,000. He takes the standard deduction of $1,600, which brings his taxable income to $83,900. Federal income tax on that comes to roughly $13,170. Then payroll taxes. Social Security takes 6.2%, and Medicare takes 1.45%, so 7.65% of the full $100,000, which is $7,750. State tax is where it gets complicated because the United States isn't really one country for this purpose. It's 50. If Sam lives in Texas or Florida or Washington, his state income tax is 0. If he lives in California, it's around $5,700. Same job, same salary, same federal government, $6,000 apart. I'm going to put American Sam in Texas, which means we are showing the United States at its most favorable. Remember that, because it matters at the end. American Sam takes home about $79,000 on 180. British Sam, $74,000. His personal allowance is $12,570, which is tax-free. It's been frozen at that level since 2021, and it's legislated to stay frozen until 2031, which is a quiet tax rise that shows up on nobody's payslip and in nobody's manifesto. Above the allowance, 20% applies up to $50,270, so $7,540. Then the higher rate of 40% kicks in on everything above that, which is $23,130 of his income, costing him $9,492. Income tax total $17,032. The national insurance. Employees pay 8% between $12,570 and $50,270, which is 3/16, and 2% on everything above, which is $474. British Sam takes home about $53,280, or roughly $72,000. Australian Sam, $142,000. The first $18,000 to $200 is completely untaxed. Then 15% up to $45,000, which is $4,020. Then 30% up to $135,000, which is $27,000. Then 37% on the last $7,000, which is $2,590. Income tax of $33,600. Add the Medicare levy of 2%, which is a $2,840. There's one more thing. At his income, without private hospital cover, Australian Sam pays a Medicare levy surcharge of 1.25%, roughly a $1,775. So he either pays the surcharge or he buys private hospital insurance for roughly the same money. Either way, about $800 leaves his account. This is a genuinely elegant piece of policy design and also a completely unavoidable bill. Australian Sam takes home about $103,750, or roughly $72 out of $900. Canadian Sam, $140,000. Federal tax first. The bottom bracket dropped from 15% to 14% this year. He pays 14% on the first $57,375, 20.5% up to $114,750, and 26% on the rest, and then knocks off the basic personal amount credit. Federal tax comes to about $24,050. Then Ontario. Provincial brackets of 5.05%, 9.15%, and 11.16%, less the provincial credit, gets him to about $2,600. But Ontario also charges a surtax on the tax, which is exactly as annoying as it sounds, 20% on provincial tax above one threshold, and another 36% above a second, which adds about $2,090. Plus the Ontario health premium of $750, which is a tax that has the word premium in it. Ontario total, about $13,440. Then CPP at 5.95% up to $74,600, plus the second tier CPP contribution of 4% above that, which together come to 4,740 sailors, plus EI premiums of going on $123. Canadian Sam takes home about $96,735, or roughly $69,000. The first scoreboard United States, $79,180. Australia, $72,900. United Kingdom, $72,000. Canada, $69,000. American Sam keeps about $10,180 more than Canadian Sam. Australia and the UK are close enough to each other that the ranking flips with a modest currency move. If you stopped the video here, you'd conclude the United States wins comfortably, and roughly 10,000 videos on this platform do exactly that. But before we go further, there's something strange buried in these numbers that almost nobody points out. These four men are not in the same social position, not remotely. In the United States, $100,000 puts Sam somewhere around the top 20 to 25% of individual earners. Comfortable, solidly above average, not remarkable. In the United Kingdom, $74,000 puts him in roughly the top 5%. British Sam is statistically a high earner. He would be one of the best paid people at most parties he attends. In Canada, $140,000 is around the top 10%. In Australia, $142,000 is roughly the top 20%. Same money, same job, wildly different rung on the ladder. Part of what we're measuring here isn't generosity or stinginess in the tax code. It's the fact that $74,000 is simply further up the British income distribution than $100,000 is up the American one. So it gets taxed like a higher income, which it is. Round two, what you get back. Take-home pay is only half a comparison. Money that gets taken and then handed back as a service isn't the same as money that gets taken and disappears. Healthcare. This is the objection everybody has already made, and it's correct, but it's correct in a more specific way than people usually mean. British Sam pays nothing at the point of use. Nothing for a GP visit, nothing for a hospital stay, nothing for surgery. Prescriptions in England carry a small fixed charge and are free in Scotland and Wales. Canadian Sam pays nothing for doctors and hospitals. Prescriptions in dental aren't covered provincially, so he relies on an employer plan costing maybe $500 a year in his share of premiums. Australian Sam has Medicare, plus the private cover he already bought to dodge the surcharge, already counted. American Sam has employer coverage. His share of the premium for single coverage runs around $600 a year, and then he has a deductible of roughly $800 before the insurance does very much, plus copays and coinsurance. In a normal year with a couple of doctor visits and one unpleasant surprise, call it $300-500 all in. So the gap is about $3,000, which is real, and which cuts American Sam's lead from $10,180 to around $7,000. But it's smaller than the rhetoric usually implies for an employed single person with decent coverage. Here's the part that isn't smaller. That $3,500 assumes Sam stays employed and stays healthy. The moment either of those stops being true, the American number doesn't shift by a few thousand, it detaches entirely. A serious diagnosis in the same year as a job loss is a financial event in the United States that has no equivalent in the other three countries. The average outcome and the worst case outcome are much further apart, and averages hide that. Retirement. This one genuinely surprised me when I ran it. Australian Sam's employer must contribute 12% of his salary into superannuation, on top of his pay. That's a 17th of $40 a year, about 11th of $980, going into an investment account with his name on it. Not a promise, not a government scheme, an account. British Sam is auto-enrolled with a minimum employer contribution of 3% and 5% from him. Canadian Sam has CPP, funded by his contributions, and a matching employer amount. American Sam might get a 401k match of 3 to 5%, or he might get nothing because it's entirely optional. So look at Australian Sam again. He takes home about $72,900 and simultaneously has roughly $12,000 a year being force-fed into an investment account. Over 30 years at a 7% return, that alone builds well over $1 million, which raises an uncomfortable question about the whole exercise. Social Security tax in the US, national insurance in the UK, CPP in Canada. I counted all of these as tax because they come off your payslip and you don't choose to pay them. But they're also buying you a pension. They're partly deferred wages wearing a costume. If you counted them as savings rather than tax, all four take-home figures would move and the American lead would narrow further because a chunk of that $7,650 in payroll tax is buying a future Social Security check. I'm leaving them classified as tax because that's how they feel and that's how the money behaves. But anyone telling you their country's real tax rate without addressing this is giving you a number, not an answer. Now, the part that does more damage to the scoreboard than tax ever did. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment, roughly, in a major city. American Sam in Austin pays about $500 a month. That's $18,000 a year, leaving him $61,180. Canadian Sam in Toronto pays about $2,400 a month, or $28,800 a year, leaving him roughly $48,470. Australian Sam in Sydney pays about $700 a week, which is a $36,400 a year, leaving him about $47,300. British Sam in London pays about $2,100 a month, which is $25,200 a year, leaving him about $38,100. British Sam went from second place to a distant last, and he did it by living in London, but now move him to Manchester, where the same apartment is about $1,100 a month. His disposable income jumps to roughly $54,200, and he leapfrogs both Australia and Canada without changing job, salary, or country. That's the finding that should reframe this entire video. The gap between London and Manchester is larger than the gap between the United Kingdom and Australia. The gap between Austin and San Francisco is larger than the gap between the United States and Canada. Which city you live in matters more than which country you live in. People spend months agonizing over the international decision and about 20 minutes on the postcode. And the postcode is doing more of the work. The flip? Now give them all 2 children. Everything above describes a single man with no dependents. Now let's make all 4 Sam's parents of 2 children under 5, both in full-time daycare, and watch the ranking invert. Approximate annual out-of-pocket childcare after subsidies for 2 children. American Sam, around $28,000. There is no meaningful federal childcare subsidy for someone at his income. He pays close to the sticker price, and in a major city, he'd pay more. British Sam in London. Eligible working parents now get a substantial block of government-funded hours, which takes a genuinely brutal sticker price down to something survivable. Call it $13,500 net. Australian Sam. The childcare subsidy covers a percentage that tapers with income. At his level, he's still getting a meaningful share covered. Call it $11,250 net. Canadian Sam in Ontario. Under the National Childcare Agreement, fees have been driven down towards roughly $10 a day per child. Call it $3,900. Subtract those from the disposable income figures. Canada, $44,570. Australia, $36,050. United States, $30,180. United Kingdom. London, $24,600. Canada went from last to first. The United States went from a commanding first to third. The entire ranking inverted, and not because anybody's tax rate changed by a single percentage point. Some caveats, said honestly. These subsidy figures depend on eligibility rules, hours used, provider availability, and income tests, and they move around more than tax brackets do. Canada's program in particular has real waiting list problems, and a subsidized space you can't get into is worth nothing. A family would also rent something bigger than a one-bedroom, which raises the housing cost for all 4, roughly in proportion. And this reverses again when the children start school, at which point American Sam's disposable income recovers sharply and stays recovered for the next 13 years. But the direction is not ambiguous, and it's the single most important thing in this video. There is no such thing as a country that's good for your money. There are only countries that are good for the specific life stage you're standing in. The United States pays high earners well and taxes them lightly, and then charges them enormous amounts for the 2 things that arrive with a family. childcare, and healthcare. It rewards you most in the years before children and after they've grown, and punishes you hardest in the decade in between. Canada takes more tax than anyone here and hands a substantial portion of it back the moment you have young children. Australia takes a middling amount and quietly builds you a retirement fund, whether you want one or not. And the United Kingdom's answer depends almost entirely on whether you live in London, which is less a country-level fact than a rent-level one, what none of these numbers capture. A few things that don't fit in a spreadsheet but change the answer anyway. Statutory annual leave. Australian Sam gets 4 weeks by law, plus public holidays. British Sam gets 28 days, including them. Canadian Sam gets 2 to 3 weeks, depending on province and tenure. American Sam is entitled to 0, not typically gets 0, legally entitled to 0. Most employers offer some, but it's a benefit, not a right, and that difference shows up the first time he's between jobs. Paid parental leave, where the gap is measured in months rather than days. Job mobility, which cuts the other way. American Sam changes employers and gets a 20% raise more easily than any of the others, and over a career that compounds into something larger than most of the differences we've calculated. And the thing nobody can price at all, proximity to the people you love. Every figure in this video is smaller than that. And I say that as someone who just spent 15 minutes calculating them. So what should you actually take from this? If you're comparing an offer abroad, 3 rules. Compare after tax, after housing, and after childcare, in that order. Never compare gross salaries. Gross salary told us the United States won by $10,000. After housing and childcare, it was third. The headline number is the least informative number in the entire calculation. Pick the city before the country. London versus Manchester moved British Sam by $16,000, which is larger than any gap between the 4 countries. Do that comparison first, because it has more leverage and you have more control over it. Ask what happens if it goes wrong. Every figure here assumes continuous employment and reasonable health. Compare the bad years too, not just the good ones, because the 4 countries are far closer on the average outcome than they are on the worst one. Because after all of that, the honest conclusion isn't that one of these countries is winning. It's that they're all making the same trade in different places. Every one of them takes money from you and hands some of it back as services. And the only real question is whether the services they hand back are the ones you personally happen to need this decade. 4 versions of the same man paid the same money, doing the same job. The gap between the best and worst outcome was about $20,000 a year, and almost none of it came from the tax rate. Subscribe to the channel for more videos working through the actual maths behind everyday money decisions. And tell me in the comments which country you're in and whether you think you're getting value for what comes off your payslip. I expect this to go extremely calmly and for everyone to agree with each other immediately. Production notes. Thumbnail. 4 vertical strips, 1 per country, each with a flag and a single large figure beneath it. Heavy caps across the middle. Who keeps the most? No VS badge on this one. The 4-way split does the work. Title options. $100,000 in the US versus UK versus Australia versus Canada. Who actually keeps the most? Same job, same salary, 4 different countries. The same $100,000 salary in 4 countries. The real math. On-screen graphics needed. 4-column waterfall. Gross at the top. Each deduction stripped away. Net at the bottom. Run them side by side so the shapes are comparable. Income percentile chart showing where each Sam sits in his own country's distribution. This is the most underappreciated point in the script. Scoreboard that visibly reorders itself 3 times. After tax, after housing, after childcare. The reorder animation is the moment worth building properly. London, Manchester, and Austin, San Francisco split. To land the city beats country point accuracy notes for recording. Every tax figure reflects the current tax year at time of writing. Recheck before publishing, and pin a comment with the date the figures were calculated. This kills the "these numbers are wrong" complaints from people watching in 2 years. Show the assumptions on screen. Single filer, no dependents, no student debt, employer health coverage in the US, Texas for state tax, Ontario for provincial tax. The childcare subsidy figures are the softest numbers in the script. Say so out loud rather than letting a commenter say it for you. Retention note. The childcare flip lands at roughly the 80% mark, and it's the strongest moment in the video. Tease it in the first 90 seconds. The country that finishes last is about to finish first. So viewers who only came for the tax comparison have a reason to stay past the scoreboard. Shorts cut downs, 3 obvious verticals here. The percentile point, same salary, top 5% in Britain and top 25% in America, the London versus Manchester swing, and the childcare flip on its own.